Did you know that even in the midst of brutal wars and religious fervor, human hearts still found ways to connect? Can you believe that during the Crusades from the late 11th century through the late 13th century, some of the most dramatic and enduring love stories unfolded? Number 5. Frederick II and Isabella II of Jerusalem. The year was 1225, and a young woman named Isabella, known also as Yolanda, stood at the heart of an unfolding drama. She was the Queen of Jerusalem, at least in title, and barely into her teens. Her claim to this distant besieged kingdom was what made her incredibly valuable. Isabella was a queen without a proper throne, a princess of a kingdom that existed more in concept than in solid, secure reality. Crusader states in the Levant were constantly under threat, squeezed between powerful Muslim empires. For these kingdoms to survive, they needed strength, resources, and leadership. From Europe, they needed a champion. That champion was to be Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor. He was a man of immense power, nicknamed Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world, for his intellect, his curiosity, and his unconventional approach to ruling. Frederick spoke multiple languages, kept a menagerie of exotic animals, and enjoyed intellectual debates with scholars of all faiths. He was not your typical Crusader king, obsessed with religious purity. Instead, he was a pragmatic and ambitious ruler who saw the East as a place of opportunity, a potential expansion of his vast empire. The marriage between Isabella and Frederick was a political arrangement, pure and simple. Isabella, at just 13 years old, was transported from Acre, a Crusader stronghold, to Brindisi in southern Italy. She was leaving behind a life of relative freedom in the Levant for a highly structured, potentially intimidating court. Her journey was long and likely daunting for a young woman. The air in Italy was different, the expectations even more so. She was brought to meet a man who was already a legend, an emperor who held sway over much of Europe. Their wedding took place in the Grand Cathedral of Brindisi. It was a lavish affair, as befitted an imperial wedding, but the human element beneath the spectacle was fraught with tension. Isabella was young, innocent, and perhaps a little overwhelmed. Frederick, a man in his early 30s, was already twice widowed and had a reputation for being demanding and somewhat imperious. He was marrying Isabella, not for love, but for her crown, for the legal right to lead a crusade and claim Jerusalem. His intentions were entirely strategic. Immediately after the wedding, Frederick asserted his authority in a way that must have shocked the young queen. He dismissed her father, John of Brienne, from his position as regent of Jerusalem. John had governed the kingdom for his daughter, and now Frederick simply pushed him aside, seizing full control. This move signaled Frederick's true nature. He was not a man to share power even with those he was supposed to protect or cherish. Isabella, now queen and empress, found herself in a position of supreme importance but very little personal power. She was a pawn in a grand political game despite her exalted titles. Life at Frederick's court was surely a whirlwind for Isabella. She was introduced to a world of intellectual pursuits, political intrigue, and the constant maneuvering of European diplomacy. Frederick was known for his wide-ranging interests, from philosophy to falconry. He surrounded himself with scholars and artists. Isabella, accustomed to the more martial, less refined atmosphere of the Crusader states, had to adapt quickly. She was expected to be a consort worthy of an emperor, to bear heirs, and to maintain the dignity of her position. The true nature of their personal relationship remained somewhat shrouded in the mists of history. Chroniclers of the time were more interested in political alliances and military campaigns than in the nuances of imperial marriages. However, it is generally understood that Frederick was not particularly gentle or affectionate with his young bride. His gaze was fixed firmly on Jerusalem, on the fulfillment of his vows to the Pope, and on the expansion of his influence. Isabella was a means to an end, a living key to a kingdom. He coveted sadly. Isabella's time as empress was brief. Just 2 years after her marriage, in 1228, she gave birth to a son, Conrad. The birth was difficult, and the young queen succumbed to the complications shortly afterward. She died at the tender age of 15, leaving behind a newborn heir and a husband who had barely known her, yet now possessed the full, undisputed legal claim to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Through Isabella's death did not deter Frederick from his ambitions. In fact, it solidified his claim to Jerusalem. He now ruled as regent for his infant son, Conrad IV, who was officially the new king of Jerusalem. This gave Frederick the mandate he needed to finally embark on his long-promised crusade. He had vowed to go to the Holy Land for years, but political squabbles with the Pope had delayed him. Now, with Isabella's death, he felt compelled to act, perhaps to honor her legacy, or simply to capitalize on the legitimate claim she had bequeathed him. Frederick's crusade, which began in 1228, was unlike any other. He did not arrive with a massive army intent on bloody conquest. Instead, he arrived in the Holy Land and immediately began negotiations with the Muslim Sultan Al-Qayyum. Frederick spoke Arabic, admired Muslim culture, and understood diplomacy better than warfare in many situations. Through skillful negotiation, and without fighting a single major battle, he managed to secure a treaty in 1229. This treaty returned Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth to Christian control. For a period of 10 years, it was a diplomatic triumph, albeit a controversial one. When Frederick entered Jerusalem, he went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and crowned himself King of Jerusalem. He did this not as a conqueror but as the legal heir, through his deceased wife, Isabella. He wore his imperial crown, not a crusader's simple one asserting his royal right. This act, while deeply significant for Christian Europe, was seen by many as a betrayal of crusader ideals, as he had negotiated with the infidel rather than fought them. Yet for Isabella's legacy, it meant that her royal line passed through her, and her infant son had indeed returned to its ancestral city, if only for a time. Isabella's short life and death directly led to this unique crusade and the brief return of Jerusalem to Christian rule. Her story is a poignant example of how a young woman, a pawn in a grand political game, could profoundly influence the course of history without ever commanding an army or issuing a decree. Her endurance lies not in a long marriage or a lifetime of shared experiences, but in the immediate appeal right, and thus shaping the narrative of a complex emperor and the fate of a holy city. Her brief life, ending so young, was pivotal. Number 4. Guy of Lusignan and Sibylla of Jerusalem. Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem in the late 12th century was a place of constant tension, a fragile outpost surrounded by more powerful Muslim neighbors. Its survival depended on strong leadership, military prowess, and a consistent flow of support from Europe. It also depended on the royal succession remaining stable. In the 1170s, the kingdom was ruled by King Baldwin IV, a young man afflicted with leprosy. Despite his illness, Baldwin was a shrewd military commander, but his condition meant he could not produce an heir. The future of Jerusalem therefore lay with his sisters. One of these sisters was Sibylla. She was a strong-willed woman, beautiful and intelligent, and fiercely protective of her family's legacy. Her first marriage had been to William Longsword of Montferrat, a powerful nobleman who seemed like a good match to secure the succession. They had a son, also named Baldwin, but William died soon after their marriage, leaving Sibylla a young widow and a mother to the future king of Jerusalem. The need for Sibylla to remarry was urgent. A ruling queen needed a king consort, someone to lead the armies and manage the kingdom's affairs. The selection of her next husband was a matter of intense political debate among the barons of Jerusalem. There were factions, disagreements, and powerful personalities, all vying for influence. The stakes could not have been higher. The very survival of the kingdom hung in the balance. In 1180, Sibylla made a choice that shocked many of her contemporaries. She chose Guy of Lusignan. Guy was a knight from Poitou, a region in France, who had arrived in the Holy Land with his elder brother, Aimery. He was known to be handsome, malak, and ambitious. However, he lacked the experience, the military reputation, or the political connections that many of the powerful barons believed were necessary for a consort to the queen. His perceived inexperience and potential for misjudgment concerned many, including King Baldwin IV. Despite the objections and warnings, Sibylla was determined. Her bond with Guy was deep and personal. It was a love match, or at least a powerful attraction, in an era where marriages were almost always political. She was drawn to Guy, and her loyalty to him proved unwavering, even when his actions were widely criticized. This personal connection, this determination to follow her heart, would shape the destiny of Jerusalem. When her brother, King Baldwin IV, finally succumbed to his illness in 1185, Sibylla's young son, Baldwin V, became king. But he too was sickly and died tragically young just a year later. This left a succession wide open and sparked a major crisis. The High Court of Jerusalem had to decide who would rule. There was another potential candidate for the crown, Sibylla's younger half-sister Isabella, who was married to Humphrey IV of Toron. Some barons preferred Isabella and Humphrey, believing they would be more effective rulers, but Sibylla, backed by her strong supporters, asserted her right to the throne. She was crowned Queen of Jerusalem. The next crucial decision was, who would be her king consort? The barons tried to pressure her into divorcing Guy, believing he was unsuitable to rule alongside her. They offered her the crown on the condition that she would choose a more capable husband. This was a direct challenge to her love for Guy. Sibylla, however, played a masterstroke. She agreed to be crowned alone, then immediately declared that she chose Guy of Lusignan as her king. She crowned him with her own hands in a public display of defiance and devotion. It was a dramatic moment, a powerful assertion of her love and her authority. She effectively said, "I choose my husband, and he will rule with me." This act solidified their joint rule, but it also deepened the divisions within the kingdom. The kingdom was now ruled by Guy and Sibylla, but it was a kingdom on the brink. The powerful Muslim Sultan Saladin, a brilliant military strategist and Mahdic leader, had been steadily consolidating his power in Egypt and Syria, encircling the Crusader states. Saladin was a formidable opponent, and the unified Christian front needed to face him was fractured by internal squabbles and the controversies surrounding Guy's rule. Guy, as king, made a series of critical errors. He lacked Saladin's military cunning. He failed to heed the advice of more seasoned commanders, and his hot-headed decisions led to disaster. The most devastating of these was the Battle of Hattin in July 1187. Guy led the Crusader army into a waterless plain where it was surrounded and annihilated by Saladin's forces. It was a catastrophic defeat, one of the worst in Crusader history. The true cross, a revered relic, was captured. Guy himself was captured, along with many other nobles and knights. The news of Hattin was a death knell for Jerusalem. With its army destroyed and its king imprisoned, the city was left vulnerable. Saladin marched on Jerusalem, and after a short siege, the city surrendered in October. It was a moment of profound shock and sorrow for the Christian world. Jerusalem, the holiest city, was back in Muslim hands after 88 years of Crusader. Throughout this unimaginable ordeal, Sibylla's loyalty to Guy remained steadfast. Even when Guy was Saladin's prisoner, Sibylla pleaded for his release. When he was eventually freed on the condition that he would leave the Holy Land, he struggled to find a place to rule. Sibylla was with him, standing by his side as he attempted to rally support and regain control. They traveled to Tyre, the last remaining major Crusader city, but Conrad of Montferrat, a powerful nobleman and claimant to the throne, refused to let Guy enter. The Sibylla did not waver. She endured the hardships of being a queen without a kingdom, a consort to a king who had lost everything. Their story, however, reached its final tragic chapter, not on the battlefield, but through illness. In 1190, during the long and arduous siege of Acre, an epidemic swept through the Crusader camp. Many, including Queen Sibylla and her two young daughters, fell victim to the disease. Sibylla died, leaving Guy without his queen and his crucial claim to the throne. Sibylla's death was a pivotal moment. With her gone, Guy's legal rights to the Kingdom of Jerusalem evaporated, as his claim had been entirely through her. The barons quickly moved to crown Sibylla's half-sister, Isabella, as the true Queen of Jerusalem, and then forced her to divorce her husband Humphrey to marry Conrad of Montferrat, who was seen as a stronger leader. Guy was left isolated, a king without a kingdom, his only connection to the crown severed. Guy eventually bought the island of Cyprus from Richard the Lionheart and established a new kingdom there, leaving the Levant political stage. He died in 1194. The enduring love story of Guy and Sibylla is one of fierce loyalty and personal devotion in the face of immense political pressure and catastrophic failure. Sibylla chose love over political expediency, and that choice, for better or worse, directly led to the events that culminated in the fall of Jerusalem. Their bond, however, was so strong that it defied the norms of their time and stands as a testament to a queen who put her heart above the crown, even as it cost her kingdom. Their story is a reminder that personal decisions, even in the grandest of historical narratives, can have world-changing consequences. Number 3. Richard the Lionheart and Berengaria of Navarre. The Third Crusade was a massive undertaking, a grand effort by the kings of Europe to reclaim Jerusalem after its fall to Saladin. Among the most prominent leaders was Richard I of England, known to history as Richard the Lionheart. He was a knightly king, a formidable warrior, and a man of great ambition. He was also initially unmarried, which was a political problem for a king embarking on a long and dangerous crusade. Richard had been engaged for years to Alice, the half-sister of King Philip II of France. However, the engagement was a messy affair, complicated by rumors and political maneuvering. Richard needed a new bride, and he needed one quickly before he set off for the Holy Land. The choice fell upon Berengaria, the daughter of King Sancho VI of Navarre. Navarre was a small but strategically important kingdom in the Pyrenees, and an alliance with them would be beneficial, especially for securing overland routes for future campaigns. Berengaria was known for her piety and her intelligence. She was not a great beauty by contemporary accounts, but she possessed a quiet strength and a deep sense of duty. The marriage was like most royal marriages of the era, primarily a political alliance. Richard himself had a reputation for not being particularly interested in women, and his focus was almost entirely on warfare and kingship. But the marriage was necessary. The arrangements for their wedding were made while Richard was already on his way to the Holy Land. He had traveled overland through France and was preparing his fleet in Marseille. Instead of waiting for him, Berengaria, accompanied by Richard's formidable mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, sailed from Naples to meet him. This journey itself was an adventure. They braved the treacherous waters of the Mediterranean, a long and potentially dangerous voyage for anyone, let alone for a queen-to-be. They finally caught up with Richard's fleet near Sicily. It was during Lent, a period when Christian tradition forbade weddings, so the marriage was postponed. Berengaria remained with Richard's sister Joan, the former Queen of Sicily. The women traveled with the fleet. As it continued its journey eastward, the journey was anything but smooth. A fierce storm struck the fleet, scattering the ships. Richard's ship managed to make it to Rhodes, but the ship carrying Berengaria and Joan was driven off course and eventually grounded off the coast of Cyprus. Cyprus was ruled by Isaac Komnenos, an independent Byzantine ruler who was hostile to the Crusaders. He initially tried to capture the women and their retinue, seeing an opportunity for plunder or ransom. Richard, hearing of his fiancée and sister's predicament, immediately sailed to Cyprus. He was furious. He invaded the island with his army quickly, defeated Isaac Komnenos, and captured him. It was a swift and decisive victory, and it showed Richard's immediate concern for Berengaria's safety and his sister's well-being. This act coming to her rescue surely left a lasting impression on Berengaria. With Cyprus secure, the wedding finally took place in Limassol, Cyprus, on May 12, 1191. It was a grand ceremony held in the castle chapel. Richard was crowned King of Cyprus, and Berengaria was crowned Queen of England, a title she would hold for many years. It was a moment of celebration, but it was also brief. Richard's attention was already turning back to the main objective, the Holy Land. Almost immediately after the wedding, Richard left Cyprus for Acre, where the Third Crusade was stalled in a long and brutal siege. Berengaria accompanied him, but she did not stay in the thick of the fighting. She remained in safer Crusader strongholds, often with Joan. Her role was primarily to maintain a dignified presence, to serve as a symbol of the English crown, and to provide support from the sidelines. She was a queen on crusade, enduring the hardships and uncertainties of war from a distance. While Richard was embroiled in the intense campaigns of the Third Crusade, battling Saladin and forging his reputation as a warrior king, Berengaria was left in the background. Their time together in the Holy Land was minimal. Richard was focused on war, on military strategy, and on achieving his goals. He was a man driven by ambition and duty. After the Crusade, Richard began his long and perilous journey home. It was during this journey that he was captured in Austria by Duke Leopold V, who had a grudge against him. Richard was then handed over to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI and imprisoned. This was a massive political crisis for England. King of England was held captive, and an enormous ransom was demanded for his release. During Richard's long imprisonment, Berengaria was not in England. She lived in France, primarily in her ancestral lands, in Navarre and later in Maine, which was part of England's continental possessions. She worked tirelessly to gather the funds for Richard's ransom. She wrote letters, lobbied influential figures, and used her own resources to contribute to the immense sum needed to free her husband. This was a period of immense stress and anxiety for her, a testament to her loyalty and resilience. Richard was finally released in 1194, after more than a year of captivity. He returned to England, then quickly departed again for France to deal with ongoing conflicts with King Philip II. The years following his imprisonment were spent primarily in warfare in France, consolidating his territories and fighting his rivals. Berengaria continued to live largely apart from Richard. Their marriage, while politically important, was not a passionate one. They had no children. Despite this, Berengaria remained his queen, a steadfast presence in his tumultuous life. She endured the long separations, the political intrigues, and the uncertainty of his wars. She managed her own estates and maintained her dignity as Queen of England. Richard the Lionheart died in 1199, struck by a crossbow bolt during a siege in France. He was campaigning as always, right up until his last moments. With his death, Berengaria became a queen dowager. She outlived Richard by many years, living until 1230. She remained a respected figure, known for her piety and her charitable works. She retired to the Abbey of the Poitou in Maine, which she founded and where she was eventually buried. The enduring love story of Richard and Berengaria is not one of fiery romance or constant companionship. It is a story of duty, loyalty, and a quiet, unshakable partnership that endured through enormous distance, political turmoil, and the constant dangers of the crusading age. Berengaria provided stability and support, a loyal partner who fulfilled her royal duties, campaigned for his release, and maintained her royal status, even when separated by continents and years. She stood by him in her own way through all of his incredible adventures and his moments of greatest peril. Her quiet strength is what makes their story an enduring one. Number 2. Louis IX and Margaret of Provence. In the mid-13th century, France was a powerful kingdom, and its king, Louis IX, was widely regarded as a model Christian monarch. He was known for his piety, his sense of justice, and his deep commitment to his faith. He was also a devoted husband and father, which set him apart from many other rulers of his time. His wife was Margaret of Provence, a woman of great beauty, intelligence, and spirit. Their union began in 1234, a time of relative peace in France, but Louis's religious fervor would soon draw them both into the heart of the Crusades. Margaret came from a family known for its intellectual and artistic flair. Her sister Eleanor was Queen of England, married to Henry III. Margaret was well educated and had a strong personality, qualities that would serve her well as queen consort to one of Europe's most pious kings. From the outset, their marriage was different from many royal unions. While arranged, there was genuine affection and respect between Louis and Margaret. They were deeply devoted to each other, a rarity in an age where marriages were often cold political calculations. Louis was a man who lived his faith. He took his royal duties as a sacred trust and governed with a strong moral compass. His piety was genuine, leading him to found hospitals, care for the poor, and build beautiful churches, including Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. It was this deep faith that eventually led him to undertake a crusade. In 1244, during a severe illness, Louis vowed to take the cross if he recovered. When he did, he immediately began preparations for a massive expedition to the Holy Land. Margaret was not merely a queen who stayed home. When Louis declared his intention to go on crusade, Margaret insisted on accompanying him. She was pregnant at the time, but her resolve was firm. This was an extraordinary decision. Most queens remained in their homeland to manage the kingdom while their husbands were away at war. Margaret, however, was determined to be by Louis' side, sharing his trials and supporting his mission. The Seventh Crusade, led by Louis IX, set sail in 1248. It was a vast undertaking, involving a large fleet and an army of thousands. Margaret, along with her children and a significant retinue of noblewomen, was part of this grand expedition. The first major stop was Cyprus, where the Crusaders spent the winter preparing for their assault on Egypt, which was seen as the key to recapturing Jerusalem. The campaign in Egypt was a disaster. Crusaders initially captured Damietta, a strategic port city, but their advance into the Nile Delta proved catastrophic. The army was decimated by disease, famine, and fierce resistance from the Egyptian forces. Louis himself fell gravely ill and was eventually captured in April 1250. Along with many of his knights, it was a moment of utter despair for the Crusader forces. During this desperate time, it was Margaret who truly showed her strength and resilience. She was still in Damietta, heavily pregnant. The city was surrounded by Egyptian forces, and many of the Crusader leaders wanted to surrender. Margaret, however, refused to give in. She displayed incredible courage, taking charge of the city's defense, even rallying the few remaining soldiers and even the common citizens. According to the chronicler Jean de Joinville, who was present on the crusade, Margaret, despite her advanced pregnancy, walked among the soldiers, urging them to hold firm. She even stood guard at the gates, inspiring hope where there was none. She was determined to hold Damietta until Louis could be ransomed. She gave birth to a son, Jean Tristan, in Damietta, named Tristan, to reflect the sorrowful circumstances of his birth. Margaret's leadership during this dark period was remarkable. She personally negotiated with the enemy commanders for supplies and for the safety of her people. Her actions were instrumental in preserving Damietta and securing a more favorable ransom for Louis and the other captives. Eventually, a massive ransom was paid, and Louis and his remaining forces were released. After his release, Louis did not immediately return to France. Instead, he decided to stay in the Holy Land for 4 more years, from 1250 to 1254. He used this time to fortify the remaining Crusader strongholds, to negotiate alliances, and to recover the bodies of fallen Crusaders for proper burial. Margaret remained with him throughout this period, sharing the hardships of life in the Crusader states. Far from the comforts of France, their long years in the East were a testament to their enduring partnership. Margaret continued to support Louis, managing the logistics of their household, caring for their growing family in a challenging environment, and acting as a trusted confidant. Their relationship was built on a foundation of deep faith, mutual respect, and shared adversity. Chroniclers often spoke of their affection, noting how Louis would seek out Margaret's company and advice. Finally, in 1254, Louis and Margaret returned to France. The Crusade had been a military failure, but Louis returned as a hero, his reputation for piety and courage enhanced by his suffering and his long stay in Holy Land. Margaret, too, was admired for her unwavering support and her bravery during the darkest moments. The years that followed were dedicated to ruling France justly and wisely. Louis continued his work as a reformer and a judge, becoming a beacon of good governance. Margaret remained his loyal queen, bearing him many children and participating actively in court life. Their home life was characterized by devotion and spiritual harmony. However, Louis's commitment to the Crusades was not over. In 1270, he embarked on another, the Eighth Crusade, aiming this time for Tunis in North Africa, hoping to convert its ruler and use it as a base for a future attack on Egypt. Margaret, by now older and having endured so much, was not able to accompany him this time, but her sons joined their father tragically. This crusade also ended in disaster. Plague swept through the Crusader camp, and Louis IX himself succumbed to the illness in August 1270, dying in Tunis. His death was a profound loss for France and for Margaret. She had been his devoted partner for over 36 years, sharing his triumphs and his immense sorrows. Margaret outlived Louis by many years, living until 1295. She continued to uphold his legacy, promoting his eventual canonization as St. Louis. Their love story is one of profound and enduring devotion, tested by the ultimate hardships of war, capture, and long separation, but ultimately strengthened by a shared faith and an unbreakable bond. It is a story of a queen who chose to be by her king's side through thick and thin, even when it meant facing unimaginable danger. Number 1. Eleanor of Aquitaine and Louis VII. Our story begins in the mid-12th century with a young woman named Eleanor, the Duchess of Aquitaine. She was arguably the most powerful woman in Europe, inheriting vast lands in southwestern France, making her one of the wealthiest and most desirable brides on the continent. She was beautiful, intelligent, comedic, and fiercely independent, with a love for poetry and courtly culture. In 1137, at the age of 15, she married Louis VII, the new King of France. Louis was a very different kind of person. He was pious, somewhat naive, and deeply religious, described by some as being more suited for a monastery than a throne. Their marriage, while initially promising, brought together two very different personalities and temperaments. Eleanor, with her vivacious spirit and love for worldly pleasures, often clashed with Louis's austere and devout nature. Despite their differences, they had a passionate beginning and quickly had two daughters. The defining moment for their relationship and for its eventual breakdown came with the Second Crusade. This crusade was called in response to the fall of the Crusader county of Edessa in 1144, a major blow to Christian control in the Levant. Louis, driven by his deep religious fervor, took the cross, vowing to lead an army to the Holy Land. Eleanor, perhaps inspired by the tales of chivalry and adventure, or perhaps keen to exert her influence, insisted on accompanying him. No queen of France had ever accompanied her husband on such a grand military expedition. Eleanor traveled with her own retinue of Aquitanian knights and ladies dressed in the style of Amazon warriors, according to some chronicles. This was a scandal to many, especially to the more conservative clerics and nobles. Her presence added a layer of complexity and drama to an already difficult undertaking. The journey to the Holy Land was long and arduous. The French army marching across Europe faced logistical nightmares and hostile populations. Tensions between the Aquitanian forces loyal to Eleanor and the northern French forces, loyal to Louis, began to simmer. Louis, as the leader, struggled to maintain discipline and control. Things took a dramatic turn when the Crusade reached Antioch, a Crusader principality in the Levant ruled by Eleanor's uncle, Raymond of Poitiers. Raymond was a handsome, modic, and worldly man, much more to Eleanor's taste than her pious husband. Reports from the time suggest that Eleanor and Raymond were very close, perhaps too close for a married queen. Rumors of an affair spread quickly through the Crusader camp. Eleanor herself became increasingly disillusioned with Louis's leadership of the Crusade. She found him indecisive, strategically inept, and too concerned with religious matters over practical military tactics. She saw the campaign failing, and she longed for the sophisticated court life of her uncle. At one point, she declared that she wanted to annul her marriage to Louis, claiming they were too closely related, a common excuse for divorce in that era. This was a direct challenge to Louis's authority, and a public humiliation for him. Louis, deeply hurt and angered by Eleanor's behavior and her demands, forcibly removed her from Antioch. He dragged her away from her uncle and continued the ill-fated march towards Jerusalem. The crusade ultimately ended in failure, with a disastrous siege of Damascus. The entire expedition was a humiliation for Louis and a source of profound disillusionment for all involved. The journey back to France was just as fraught with tension as the journey out. Their marriage was irrevocably damaged. The initial passion had turned into resentment, and the cultural and personal differences had become insurmountable. They had started their journey as a united royal couple, but they returned as estranged partners, their marriage a shell. Upon their return to France in 1149, the formal process of annulment began. Despite the Pope's initial efforts to reconcile them, it was clear that the marriage could not continue. Louis was deeply pious, but he needed a male heir to secure the French succession, and Eleanor had only given him daughters. Eleanor, for her part, chafed under Louis's rigid control and felt stifled by his devout nature. In March 1152, just 4 years after their return from the Holy Land, the marriage was officially annulled on the grounds of consanguinity. They were distantly related. This was a convenient legal loophole to dissolve a politically inconvenient marriage. Eleanor, the powerful Duchess of Aquitaine, was once again free. Her freedom, however, meant she was a highly sought-after prize. Within 2 months of her annulment, Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou. Henry was a fiery, ambitious, and energetic young man 11 years her junior. He was everything Louis was not: a brilliant military strategist, a ruthless politician, and a man who loved worldly power. Their marriage created the vast Angevin Empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, encompassing more of France than Louis himself controlled. Henry soon became King Henry II of England, and Eleanor, the former Queen of France, became Queen of England. This second marriage produced many children, including the future kings Richard the Lionheart and John. Eleanor and Henry's relationship was tumultuous and often violent, but it was incredibly productive in terms of heirs and power. The split between Eleanor and Louis had massive repercussions for European politics. It led to generations of conflict between France and England, as the English kings, through Eleanor's inheritance, now held vast territories within what France considered its own. Plantagenet Empire became a constant threat to the French monarchy, leading to centuries of warfare, including the 100 Years' War. Eleanor of Aquitaine continued to be a formidable figure even when imprisoned by Henry II for her role in a rebellion by her sons. She lived to an old age, witnessing the reigns of her sons and shaping the political landscape of Europe. Louis VII, after the annulment, eventually found a more suitable queen in Adele of Champagne, who gave him a son, Philip Augustus, who would become one of France's most powerful kings. The love story of Eleanor of Aquitaine and Louis VII is enduring, not because it lasted, but because it broke so spectacularly and had such profound consequences. It shows how personal relationships, especially among powerful monarchs, could directly shape the destiny of nations. Their initial love, its disillusionment, and its eventual annulment during the crucible of the Second Crusade set in motion events that would define European history for centuries. It's a tale of two very different people forced together by circumstance whose failed union had a ripple effect across an entire continent.